Today, we're discussing something that has a critical role to play in the journey towards net zero in 2022 and beyond. We all know that net zero means we're facing a rapid rise of technologies, such as renewables, electric vehicles and heat pumps. But these technologies are just the visible tip of the iceberg. Lying underneath these impressive physical signs of our society's decarbonisation are the vast number of mechanisms, investments and system-wide changes which are needed to support them. So this is where our subject of today comes in. RIIO 2 is the second set of price controls that our electricity and gas networks are regulated under within the RIIO framework. Set by Ofgem and standing for revenue equals incentives plus innovation plus outputs, RIIO defines the investment, expenditure and what system and network operators will deliver to customers. This performance-based price control will be a key force in laying down the tracks that determine the direction and pace of our journey to a smart, clean and flexible energy system over the coming decade. And with the RIIO ED2 price control for the distribution network starting in 2023, there's a lot we can expect to see over the coming years. So, whilst 2021 was a pivotal year, 2022 must lead the way in terms of setting the trajectory and ambition of what we should expect during RIIO 2.
So the UK has really become a world leader in local flexibility markets. Over the past 5 years, really coming from a standing start to really starting to demonstrate tangible volumes. And today, we've got an amazing panelists from all corners of this emerging sector to talk about why we think the last 5 years has gone so well, and more importantly, what about the next 5 years? What about RIIO 2? We've got Stathis Mokkas from UK Power Networks. Nice to be here. Welcome. We have Shona Watt from National Grid ESO. We have William.
Either James.
We have Will Goldsmith from ev.energy, and we have Doug Cook from Ofgem. Thank you, everyone. So why don't you kick us off, Stathis? UK Power Networks is perceived as a world leader within the UK as driving forward the local flexibility. What's been the secret for success? And what, where are you going to take flexibility and the DSO model going forward?
Thanks for the background, and the kind of, the thumbs up message. I mean, I think we've been very clear in pushing hard for flexibility from the day pretty much we conceived the idea, which starts like pretty much more than 5 years ago, from 2017 onwards. Simplicity, transparency, visibility. Piclo helped a lot with us in that sense. So I don't think the recipe is going to fundamentally change a lot, because these things are the stuff that stakeholders want and they seem to be working. So keep pushing for that. And in the context of a DSO, that's going to be even more helpful as well. And we can talk about the interaction with other players in the sector, but effectively this is the key recipe as well.
So more of the same?
More of the same, but keep on harder, keep pushing harder, go wide, go deep, more products, so that it works effectively. And we stick to that. I mean, we can talk about our RIIO 2 business plan, but it's also the framework and the continuity of policy that we have seen from RIIO 1 to RIIO 2, and probably we're talking in RIIO 3 in a few years' time. Mm-hmm. But effectively, that we actually managed to put down a business plan, our proposals to the regulator, submitting a clear flexibility-driven plan, which is going to drive not only the sector for the next 5 years, but pretty much towards net zero, because ultimately that's the goal, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, keep banging the drum and keep doing the hard work.
And so regulation obviously plays a really important role, and I would add that the RIIO incentive model, the TOTEX model, is the envy of the world. We're out and looking at a lot of different markets, and with the rollout of the clean energy package, everyone's got their eyes on the GB model and how it has created some of these really positive first steps. So where do we go from here? How can we do even more? What's Ofgem's spin on this?
Excellent question. I think basically connecting the dots. So I think you described these first steps and stuff as UKPN's work, Piclo's work, etc. The GB market has become known for this type of innovation. The question now is, we've demonstrated that initial flexibility, we've demonstrated the initial tranche of response. How can we get customer-owned assets being flexible in such a way that we can achieve even greater outcomes? How can we link things that are required at the local level, constraint alleviation for Stathis and his colleagues, to absorbing the incredible quantity of renewable energy we're going to have in the wholesale markets? How can we reduce balancing costs? How can we integrate across markets by standardizing and standardizing and integrating the various product understandings and definitions, so that the same flexibility providers, who are representing assets fundamentally, can be helping different buyers of their services at the same time. And so connecting the dots is my synthesis.
And what role does Ofgem play in making these dots connect more effectively?
Well, fundamentally, as the regulator, hopefully we identify where the dots are, and hopefully we're able to encourage our colleagues in the industry to proactively connect those dots. I mean, the RIIO 2 plans are obviously now published and widely discussed. They're heading in that direction. And so RIIO 1 was getting the foundations right, proving that it works. RIIO 2 is connecting the dots. And RIIO 3 is the final stretch, if you want, to net zero in the power system by 2035. And all being well, hopefully, fingers crossed, we've got the right foundations. And now the question is, okay, so what next? How do we bring these things together? Where do we go from here? And our view is precisely that: interoperability, standardization, commonality, and trying to really scale and grow the thing we've seen.
And so, Will, as a flex provider, and I guess a lot of people might not appreciate how much of a role that EVs play in flexibility markets, but as we've seen with some of the UKPN results from the last few years, electric vehicles and storage are some of the major players. So, where do you see the market going? What do you see? We've got a kind of common goal here. I think everyone's aspiring how we can scale this up. What are the real challenges to delivering this? And being a scale up yourself, yeah. What is it that you would have on your wish list to your esteemed colleagues on the panel here?
Some brilliant questions within that, James, and I'll have a go at answering them. I think firstly, as you've called out, electric vehicles as a technology are a real game changer in this space. So when you get an electric vehicle, charging that electric vehicle typically doubles the average electricity consumption of a home. So it's really kind of increasing the load that's going to be on the grid. But where it gets really interesting is when that charging happens and takes place is flexible. So most people come in and plug in around 6 p.m. when they get home from work or whatever they've been doing that day, which is like a peak time on the grid. But then they don't need their car till 8 o'clock the next morning. So they've got a big window, like 14 hours there, to do normally 1 to 3 hours of charging. And so we can shift that load and make it flexible. So whereas traditional domestic load, such as like heating, cooking, watching TV, you don't really want to alter your behavior patterns when you do that. But the great thing about with electric vehicles is we can smartly charge your car at the best times while you're asleep. So yeah, firstly, that's kind of the new technology that is driving flexibility within electric vehicles. In terms of where the market's going and the challenges, it's been said a few times, but I think the real key here is scale. So we've been working really closely with UKPN over the last few years on some fantastic innovation projects like Project Shift. And what's been so successful, I think, particularly with UKPN and other utilities we've been working with, is it's setting that vision initially, so kind of making a commitment to do something, then really investing in innovation, but critically then taking that innovation into business as usual. So taking things that have been learned through Project Shift and other innovation projects, putting them into commercial flexibility tenders, and then growing that. So we launched the first virtual power plant of electric vehicles in December with UKPN. So we've started that small now, and it's about growing and scaling that. And to do that, a real key thing is consumers and getting EV drivers on board with this by simplifying it and making compelling propositions.
Mm-hmm. So from your perspective, growth for you means about having compelling consumer proposition and then having all the right markets and revenue streams and ability to flex and get paid for it and working streamlined in the background.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of moving parts, and I think that's probably quite important to emphasise at this stage. And initially, when you dive into innovation, you sometimes go into a lot of detail and detailed market designs, and a trial might trial 5 different ways of doing the same thing. I think what's important now is we consolidate a lot of that learning and find out what's working well, what works, and then bring it up a level and simplify again so that we can scale from,
So getting some sense of a pattern here. We've got connecting the dots, we've got simplifying, how do we scale up? There's some interesting themes here. So talking about scale, we've got representative from the ESO here, where you've been doing flexibility markets for quite some time. And I think now the interesting dynamic, I guess, twofold. One, the increased procurement of assets on the distribution network. How do you play into ESO markets? And secondly, as UKPN and other networks start managing their own DSO operations, how does that coordinate? So where does this all sit on the ESO's roadmap? How, where are the big challenges and what are the real opportunities for players like ev.energy?
Well, as you say, the ESO have got a bold ambition to be able to operate a net zero system by 2025. But we recognise that this will require a lot of changes to our services, products and systems. And fundamentally, we need to make changes to enable broader participation in our services, especially from renewable generators. So we've been making strides in bringing a lot of our ancillary services markets closer to real time. So a good example is the day-ahead market for dynamic containment that we rolled out during the COVID pandemic. And we're going to extend that principle into our whole suite of response services. And this is clearly very important, overlaid with the fact that our requirements for response and faster acting response are increasing due to the higher levels of penetration of intermittent plant on the system.
Mm-hmm. So we've got increased complexity. I think that's obviously a key challenge as we decarbonise. We've got, I think, a lot of ambition. It's quite amazing to think. In 2025, we're only a small number of years away from that. Are we on track?
Indeed. Well, if we nuance the ambition a little, we want to be in a position where we are able to operate the system at net zero. Obviously, that's different to the assets materialising to enable us to do that. So we want to do as much as we can to reduce barriers to entry in many of our markets. And a good example of that is the balancing mechanism, where relatively recently we removed the need for distributed energy resources to install dedicated VPNs and SCADA systems. Instead, they can take advantage of our new MQTT interface to bypass a lot of the sort of initial administrative and operational requirements burden that previously would have been required for those assets to participate.
Uh-huh.
So definitely making progress in that direction.
And so we're talking about streamlining participation. I know UKPN put a lot of efforts into this, and we're delighted to play a role in supporting you on that. What have been some of the key learnings that you kind of wish to sort of double down on as we go into the next price control period?
Double down. Let's see what has worked to date, and then going back to pretty much the cycle of the way we play the conversation here is like we can see that the ESO had experience with running markets, so we actually took on board some of those learnings and applied it straight out into our flexibility markets. We took on board the feedback straight from the likes of ev.energy in terms of how they want the actual product to be, how we can make it easier for them to access, how it makes it easier for them to explain it to their customers, because we can discuss between me and Will everything we want, and then it becomes an incomprehensible issue for the end customer, right? So the flexibility one pick up. We're going to be both at a loss. Then coming up to the dots that Doug mentioned, effectively, the continuity is allowing us as a system operator to actually make the market and pretty much drive that continuity on the market itself. The product standardization is something we all have worked together. We acknowledge the complexity that you mentioned previously with ASO, and we're working very well. I mean, over the past few years, like we had one-off kind of major innovation projects through Power Potential where we were trying to resolve combinedly the reactive power issues on the transmission system with a distribution market. That's really a first of the world, and it kind of puts the blueprint for everything that will follow. We have the industry forum through the open networks at the ENA, where we understand how we resolve the complexity, how we align the services, how we resolve conflicts of services, how we increase the transparency of information. So all these, I wouldn't say we double down what we've done, because we know we've done the right things in a way. That's what the feedback has been. So I would say, just going back to what I said earlier, just keep pushing and keep listening, because probably, let's say in a year from now, there will be customers going to Will and saying, no, I want your product to be slightly different. So we're going to have to keep on that dialogue to understand what the end consumer wants and needs, because that's effectively the key outcome that we want to get.
Exactly. Doug, you mentioned something interesting about where RIIO2 sits in the journey to net zero. If you may, for a moment, sort of just step back from the here and now and kind of maybe paint a picture for where you think the market's going to be at the end of RIIO2. What does that turning point look like? What do we have to achieve collectively as an industry over, by 2028?
Wow.
Futurologist,
as well as Ofgem colleague. I suppose I'd look at this by working backwards. Where do we need to be by 2035? And why 35? Because of net zero in the power system and the implications that has for all of us, for us and for society in general. 2028 is what, 7 years, 6.5 years, depending on exactly when the end of RIIO2 falls, if you're pedantic, to this net zero nirvana. So by that point in time, we have effectively one more regulatory cycle, RIIO3, let's call it for the sake of discussion today. We need to, and that's it. By that point, we need to be at net zero. So we need to have done lots of things in RIIO2, some of which obviously behoven on the distribution network, some of which are behoven on all of us. We need to define net zero. I mean, that sounds completely crackers, but actually what is net zero? Will Big Ben have a green flashing light on it when we get there? What are the KPIs that we're tracking against? Who is actually able to lay out and define what a net zero distribution network would look like? I'm not trying to put Stathis on the spot, but we've never had that conversation, he or I privately, nor the industry as a whole. And we need to start thinking about that. I think by the end of RIIO2, we need to know, we all need to agree, so it's not just about discussing it in 2027 and a half, it's a conversation we should really be starting ASAP. What actually do we need to have achieved by the end of RIIO2? What are the hard lines in the sand we need to have got to, and how do we know? And that's not a reflection on the RIIO2 plans, it's not a reflection on the hard work that's gone into those. I think they are a step in the right direction. The question is, how far is it from the end of that step to this net zero goalpost? In terms of practicalities, we need to have scaled. Like by 2028, we need to have demonstrated this at scale, because if we haven't demonstrated it by then, we need to be desperately seeking alternatives. I genuinely hope we have. Mm-hmm. If we've got, how many million EVs on the road by 2028, ballpark?
11,
okay,
15.
So if we've got somewhere north of 10, let's say north of 10 for the sake of conversation, we've got somewhere north of 10 million EVs on the road, and we haven't demonstrated that they are collectively flexible upon request, then we need to be looking at a system where we have a significant amount more generation, we have a significant amount more network, because we need to accommodate and provide for the transport mechanisms that we within the energy industry geekily refer to as EVs, but the average person would describe as their car or their motorbike or whatever it is. So by 2028, we need to know where the end state is, define that, and we need to have proven at scale a lot of the concepts. This is what I mean by connecting the dots. It's not to say that the work we have done so far isn't fantastic, it has been, but I hear the word trial, I hear the word innovate. Those are all true. Now it's consolidate, demonstrate, scale. Get it right, golden, get it wrong, back to the drawing board as quickly as we can, ideally perhaps even before 2028. If something's not working, we need to have a more honest discourse within the industry, and we need to fix it quicker. We need to close the cycle between innovation, scale, and demonstration.
I think there's some really, thought-provoking ideas there. I mean, that's why we're all here. We need to decarbonize the energy system. We cannot do that just with forgetting about consumers, because ultimately they're paying for this. So we can't just go wild and build grid everywhere. We have to do it in a cost-effective way, hence flexibility. But we need to do it quickly. And I think the real challenge, in my view, is coming at this from an innovator in the space. Things are really starting to accelerate now, and it's exciting. And we start to call ourselves a scale-up rather than a startup. But in terms of if you zoom out, the amount of change that needs to happen, and the amount of scaling up that needs to happen, we've got a huge amount of acceleration and course correction to do as an industry, which is frankly exciting and terrifying at the same time, but absolutely necessary. I think there's one thing which has always struck me about the energy sector is it's very regional. Everywhere has its own sort of instance. And I think if you look at the internet and the World Wide Web, it's very not regional. It's a global system, and I'm very keen for that type of thinking to start permeating the energy world. So I guess on that note, I know ev.energy is you guys have broken into the States now, or you're about to go there?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a really fast-growing user base now in the States. Mainly around California, which is sort of the home of Tesla and electric vehicles, but also now in Texas, New York, Massachusetts. So yeah, North America is a really interesting market for us.
So what's your impression about commonalities, differences, things that we should be sharing, learning in your domain?
Yeah, it's such a good question because there is so much to learn, I think, from different markets and different companies. I think starting off with learnings from the UK, some things that have been really fantastic over the last couple of years is the evolution and concept of a DSO, and then from that the creation of local flexibility markets. So that's something that's been really interesting that we've been working on with utilities across North America. Both those that are vertically integrated and those in competitive markets. The other thing that the UK's led on really well is policy around smart charging. And this is a fantastic example as well of iterative policy. So as Doug was saying, we need to have a clear direction that we're going in, but then rather than working on sort of massive projects that take 10 years, breaking it down. So the BEIS and Ofgem were very involved, in the ev.energy task force introduced the Smart Charge grant, which identified, okay, smart charging is going to really help. That can be a big part of the solution. But we don't have the technology yet. It's not there. So let's try and create a grant that will stimulate a market. That happened. It was really successful. The UK now has more charge point manufacturers producing more innovative technology and hardware that is now shipping internationally. We've created an export business in smart charge points, which is great. The phase 2 of this is now looking at, okay, we can't live on grants forever, so let's remove the grant, let's introduce policy and mandate. So from June this year, all private charge points sold in the UK will need to be smart and have smart functionality and be able to interact with the grid. So that's a fantastic step. And then there's more steps that Doug and I were discussing earlier, where you have to go beyond this and look at control, and when you're starting to control very large volumes at scale, how that impacts on the grid, and you've got to think about cybersecurity and things like that. So that's a fantastic direction. So we've been taking that learning from the UK and applying it to California. California is now looking at introducing smart charging policy and regulation. And as one of the largest economies and states in the US, what California adopts will then likely be the standard across the rest of America. In terms of what we can learn from the US did a very different approach to the rollout of smart meters, where it was, instead of energy suppliers responsible, it was networks. So if you lived in New York, for example, you got a knock on the door and someone came around with a van and it's like, we're installing smart meters on your street this week, and the whole street got done. And so in the US, the availability of smart meters and access to that data is much, much more widespread and accessible. So we're actually finding that a lot of the framework and ability to create these markets is there, but the market design isn't necessarily, and there's still legacy issues around market design and how baselining is dealt with and such like. So yeah, definitely lots to learn from both.
Yeah, some really good insights. So you mentioned cybersecurity, and I immediately wanted to ask some questions here, because obviously we're maintaining critical national infrastructure, and broadly speaking, more of it's going to the cloud. Not all of this, but more of the going to the cloud. How is the ESO considering this? Is there a sort of framework? What's going through your minds when we think about cybersecurity at ESO?
So clearly, this is critical. Looking forwards as more, we have the sort of drivers to move towards greater data sharing in the industry, and clearly the energy industry represents critical infrastructure. So yeah, the National Grid, ESO, are clearly taking that very seriously, and have work streams in place to ensure that security measures are in place to prevent any data breaches. Yep.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. At the end of the day, I think it's all about data. It's this whole digitalization of the energy sector, and when I look at local flexibility, that's just a subset of decentralization of system operation as well. And data is going to be key. Interoperability between different systems. I'm keen to get views from all the panelists on this topic, but do you want to kick us off about interoperability and how the ESO is going about this?
So I think the sort of case study from the American markets and California is very interesting in comparison to the GB market. William, you mentioned California being somewhat ahead of the game in terms of smart metering, and clearly there were harsh lessons that we learned in this country in terms of the first generation of smart meters not being interoperable, and that's very much hindered progress in this country compared to California. And you see far wider use of or rollout of time of use tariffs accordingly in markets like California. And these are really going to be critical to help facilitate and encourage the passive demand shifting that we require to help us get to our net zero goals. I think you mentioned the Power Shift project that you've been running in conjunction with UK Power Networks. At National Grid ESO, we've been involved in a similar project called Flex, which looked at a real cohort of customers with varying degrees of flexible residential demand, and explored the potential of that to contribute to the overall flexibility the system needs going forwards. And these customers we compared the response of customers on flat tariffs to those on time of use tariffs, such as Octopus's Go and Agile tariffs. And yeah, similar to your own results, it demonstrated a real material contribution of shaving. I think it was, in this case, the extrapolation would have been equivalent to around 15% of total system peak demand. So we're completely on board and singing from the same hymn sheet in terms of the potential being proven through these trials. But yeah, I echo what Doug says, is that time is of the essence, and we now have to translate this potential in the trial space into far greater rollout of these clearly extremely powerful means of extracting more flexibility from the demand side.
And from UKPN's perspective, as we know through working with you, it is all about data and interoperability. Can you talk us through some of the sort of key kind of ways forward that you're taking this around? I know some of the open data projects you're working on, and also some of your plans for RIIO 2 in terms of creating that more of an ecosystem approach.
Yeah. So it's good that you mentioned. I mean, like the whole thing is going to become about data, because those data are going to support the flexibility markets we're discussing here, and effectively this is how you're going to drive the net zero world that Doug says that we need anxiously to get there sooner rather than later. So I mean, yes, the open data portal is one where we make everything available. We had the dedicated also flexibility microsite. We are supporting the development of APIs and the interoperability. We all work with the ESO currently also on regional development programs, exactly to facilitate not only the publication of information for the market to develop and deliver the solution, but also for system operator to make that coordination efficiently. So all these kind of ecosystem, from, let's say, the Wokingham control room to the UK APM control room to the other DNOs control room, because that would be necessary as well, to the aggregators, to the end consumer through smart meters, it pretty much requires that interoperability and the availability of data, because you miss one link there, you miss either the data or the interoperability, and as already said, I mean, like we just miss the outcome. So the business plan is built on that availability and interoperability of data, and we are working already in that direction. I mean, past just the ED2 submission, we are currently still in ED1, just to be clear, right? We have a few more months to go, but it's already, we are going in that direction, and in rolling out innovation to BAU, I mean, like between Doug and Will, we already kind of mentioned that we had the innovation project in flight, and we realized, okay, there's clear lessons you can throw out there and use them as BAU for LV flexibility, first of a kind. We'll trial it, work, why not keep trying? So that was availability of data for LV substations. We tried to make it as friendly as possible for the aggregators. They came through, so that's, that's going from concept to trial to BAU and delivering the end benefit to the consumer.
And from your perspective, from someone who needs access to this data, both to sort of find where the revenue streams are and to operate your assets, what more do you want to see from DSOs, from the ESO, from maybe markets in general, that would be important for your journey as a business?
I think a really key part of this with data, so data, as you say, is critically important to all of this. In my role at ev.energy as head of grid services, data got added to that about 6 months ago, so it's now grid and data services, so it's very, very linked and tied together. I think in terms of how we've historically thought about data in the energy industry, that data has come from generators or power plants, commercial entities, from industry, and the scale of that data has been a lot less. In terms of the scales, we've gone from having tens or hundreds of power stations or power plants around the country to now, when we talk about distributed generation, we're talking about tens and hundreds of thousands. We're going to have millions of electric vehicles. So the scale of the data is totally different. And also, instead of being corporate data, it is now consumer data. And that's really key. So with all this data, we need to think very much about trust and transparency, as well as the cybersecurity element. So at ev.energy, how we're thinking about it is making sure we're always putting the electric vehicle driver first. And if we can explain to them transparently exactly how a driver's data is being used, that it's secure, safe, anonymized, it's only being used within their interest to help them, that they have the option to opt out if they want to of anything, that they're still in control and own that data, that's really important. And from a security point of view, if we can ensure we can keep the data secure for one driver, that really helps on keeping it secure on a high scale level when we start to talk about national infrastructure. And I think a previous side conversation with Doug here is what we need from the industry is, I think, a little bit more thought leadership. There's this idea of load controllers or aggregators and actually having a standard. So we want to be able to, I think, still allow new entrants and small companies into the industry to trial out and do new things. But once people start reaching a certain size and scale and delivering services at scale commercially, how can we have a simple, clear way of set of standards that validate that the data privacy standards for consumers and the cybersecurity standards with regard to encryption and everything else are met, so that we build trust. We build trust between ourselves in providing services within the industry, but we also critically provide trust with that in consumer.
Yeah. If I may, James, I mean, I love the idea, Will, of putting the customer at the heart of this entire exercise. I think that's critical. I don't think we'll have scale customer flexibility without trust. In fact, heaven forbid we ever have a front page headline of where something goes wrong or someone's data gets breached or something like that. You can just imagine the average EV owner shying away from this concept, and that's a bad thing for all of us. That's a bad thing for the public. And so I think putting the customer first, absolutely love it. Yeah, wholeheartedly agree. I think the next step after that is some forms of standardization. And again, this is a connecting the dots sort of point. There's been so many trials, there's been so many projects, there's been so much learning. Everybody's got their own use cases for this data now. Everyone's got their own requirements for the data. If Will and his colleagues who are, frontline, if you forgive me saying so, with these customers have that relationship, they're actually talking to the EV owner. Ofgem, certainly not. You guys probably aren't, or at least very arm's length. How can we make sense? How can we make sure that all this data is structured in such a way that Will and ev.energy and obviously other companies can reflect that to the consumer such that they give their permission? How can we make sure that all that data is flowing in one consistent way, end to end in the value chain? So the slice of data that Stathis needs of highly aggregated information about the 10,000 electric vehicles in the UK Power Networks patch, or many millions of EV vehicles, can come to him in a way that is cohesive and smooth from the 16 different charge point operators, sorry, you're not going to have them all, in such a way that he gets what he needs. And likewise onwards to Shona, so the ESO can sit there and say, great, we see all 11 million, but a level of granularity and fidelity that means they're not drowning in the complexity of the data sets. And this requires, to my mind, something which, as a side note, I really liked out of the Energy Digitalisation Task Force report, the concept of some limited public data infrastructure that underpins some of this stuff. For me, basic stuff like data ontologies, what metadata are we collecting, that we could all agree, frankly the five of us could probably agree if we had enough time and a few glasses of wine, that we can then lay out in such a way that Will and his colleagues can interface with the customer and that they can understand, that they retain that right, that control, and that we can all get what we need from it. But that requires some degree of planning. You use the word thought leadership, of actually we need to set out what the right answers are, float those, to have a robust debate, a robust discussion, but ultimately focus it around what's acceptable to the driver. But even stepping past cars, to the heat pump owner, to the person with a smart car, and most importantly of all, to the vulnerable consumer who doesn't necessarily have this degree of energy understanding and would otherwise be completely confused by this entire conversation. And that's a critical challenge of the next 5 or 6 years. Sorry, Shona, please.
Yeah, and just to win the hearts and minds, we really have to demonstrate the benefit. There's a piece of work being conducted in the Open Networks project at the moment, which really is trying to demonstrate the cost benefit of greater distributed energy resources visibility, because clearly it's not costless putting greater operational metering and sensors and so on in place. And in order to kind of get a rough quantification of the potential benefits at transmission level, the ESO's ability to forecast more accurately net transmission demand is truly critical in our ability to mitigate a very steep increase in balancing costs that by the end of this decade could rise to as high as £2.5 million billion pounds per annum. And so just a very small percentage decrease in that via greater forecasting of output at distribution level, could deliver significant cost benefit to the customers, because ultimately those balancing costs will be passed on to consumers in the form of higher BSUOS costs that are integrated into retail tariffs. So this is something that we're very much keen to explore, but I fully agree it's an exercise in how we portray that narrative to the general public. Yeah.
So I think to round us off, I'm going to ask everyone to think of what is their wish. You've got a wish list, you've got one wish. I think setting the context, we're all wanting to get to a reliable, cost-effective net zero, to be defined, net zero energy system. How do we get there? What is, from your own perspectives, from your organisation's perspectives, what is it that we need? And we'll start here, Stathis.
So you give me the least time of everyone to think about it. So I would say, I mean, like, if there's one wish, is like, keep the focus there on, the outcome that Doug described, that, net zero is upon us, right? It sounds like 2035 for the power system, but practically we need to think what we need to have done yesterday and do it more and keep the focus. Because that focus will bring then the urgency around how much data you share and how quickly, how you quantify the flex service, how you adapt your products, how you need to evolve your regulation to an extent. I mean, like, the Ofgem has done a great job in bringing forward, the LC31, which requires us to publish more information, right? I feel comfortable being here from UKPN because we actually were above and beyond the requirements there even before that came into place, right? And that will help Will in bringing effectively more solutions to the flexibility market, and that will help us, which is what we have done, like, bring effectively a flexible solution in our business plan, which will save, some 400 million of future investment exactly by just bringing flexibility into life. Yeah. So just keep the focus. Perfect.
Shona?
So speaking from a personal perspective, and also as the team that's exploring wider net zero market reforms in a longer term holistic context, I believe that providing sharper signals in the wholesale market, both in time and space, is going to be crucial to extract the flexibility that we need from the demand side, without which we're going to struggle to meet our net zero ambitions.
Perfect. So we've got keep the focus, we've got clarity on market design and time and space. I like that. Will?
So, yeah, keeping focus on what's going well. The DSO markets, helped facilitated by Piclo and procurement procurers like UK Power Networks, have been fantastic at getting domestic flexibility and demand-side response to provide flexibility. We know that as time goes on, demand-side response is going to massively explode in terms of the availability of it, as is the requirement for flexibility, so that's critical. At the moment, though, demand-side response is not able to access the balancing mechanism or the wholesale market in an active way, and that's because residential metering is still done on profile classes. So until the proper rollout of smart meters and half-hourly settlement, which the current timeline has been pushed back multiple times, it's now sitting at 2025, we can't really start to scale in those critical markets with demand-side response. So I think maybe after today, we could go away and think, how can we bring that forward? Doug was saying by 2028, we need to have made progress. If we wait till 2025 to start doing demand response in the BM and wholesale market, I think that could be a bit too late. So how can we bring that forwards and get learnings sooner?
That's a great challenge. I think actually setting out the timelines like that makes it really clear that those things don't add up. Yeah. Great challenge.
Maybe just qualify your statement slightly, William, by just saying that there are early examples of participation of EV assets, for example, in the balancing mechanism via virtual lead party aggregators. But obviously, I totally agree. They're very much in their infancy.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you also have elective half-hourly settlement, but currently less than 2%, I believe, is the figure of residential demand is there. So, yeah, how do we scale that?
So it's possible, but it's not open you know, there's a couple of barriers and constraints which are, you know, we need to release the brakes on, sorry to use the car-based pun. Doug, I'll leave the last word. What's on the wish list?
Crikey. There's benefits to going for a Stathis, I promise. Will, you've hit on a couple of good ones. For me, this is all part of this whole connecting the dots narrative. We just need to get better at sharing information and learnings amongst ourselves, and realizing and exposing where there are these challenges or contradictions, none of which are intended. They're all product of the past, a product of a system in transition. So we need to do that. If I may, though, James, for a second, I'm just going to step away from the immediacy of the conversation and look at financing. So I wish there's going to be I genuinely, sincerely hope there'll be 11 million EVs on the road, not just because I'm a technologist at heart, but also because, obviously, for the planet that we all want to live in, that's a better outcome. But I think we have a real affordability challenge. I know we've not spent a lot of time today discussing the gas crisis and consequential impacts on bills. It's really not the focus of the discussion. But even before that, there were a significant number of people in the UK who couldn't put their hands in their pockets or into their bank accounts and access the capital required for the assets that we need for net zero. What do I mean? Heat pumps, electric vehicles, smart technologies, energy efficiency upgrades, permanent lasting improvements to their homes that both improve their quality of life and reduce their demand profile. So I think as an energy industry, my ambition, my aspiration is that we digitalize, and that by digitalizing, we create metrics, abilities for financiers, private financiers especially, to understand decentralized assets, much in the same way that they've understood wind farms, that you can now get, you know, some kind of a financial offtake agreement for a wind farm relatively easily in any commercial bank. What about for a fleet of EVs? What would it take to mobilize the COP26 present commitments in finance and ESG and all those good noises that we heard to come to bear on flexibility, to come to bear on the recognition that the bulk of these assets have to satisfy multiple use cases? The first and foremost is heating somebody's home, or taking the kids to school, or whatever the thing might be, or driving to work, and simultaneously providing flexibility in the power system. And for me, that's all linked into how do we make those things affordable. And that's critical, because affordability stems from revenue streams. Revenue streams stems from flexibility, from understanding, from consistency, etc. So if we can connect all those things, we'll be set.
Absolutely. I think that's a nice sort of summary, you know, going from let's keep the focus, let's keep going with this, because we're doing some really good steps. Let's think about the market design, make sure that it's fit for purpose and it's providing the sharpness and signals. Let's not elude ourselves. There are barriers. We haven't got it all right at the moment. Let's make sure that we address them quickly and effectively and not push it into long grass. And then the crucial role of digitalization in actually unlocking all of this, especially the finance, because, you know, there's trillions of pounds worth of investment that needs to go into the global decarbonisation efforts, and digitalisation is going to play a really key role there. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining me in the panel, and thanks to everyone listening at home at your leisure. If you think this is going to be the first of a series, hopefully a series of panel discussions and videos led by Piclo with esteemed colleagues in the market. So if you liked what you listened here today, get in touch, let us know, and we'll generate more of these interesting debates. I've had a good time today, and thanks everyone for taking part.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Very much.
Cheers.